So we've been we're making preparations to enter into a study of the epistle to the Philippians. And as we do, I want to observe, and we did last week, want to continue to observe Luke's account in the book of Acts, as to what were the things that transpired as Paul and those with him made their way into the city of Philippi in setting up to plant the church. And so last week we observed the conflict that resulted between Paul and Barnabas from serving together in this particular second missionary journey that they're getting ready to begin. Paul left and went to Cyprus with John Mark, and Paul took Silas and went into Cilicia and Tarsus, and so we discussed how godly men with godly intentions may not always see eye to eye. They may disagree and they may choose to part ways, as Paul and Barnabas did, but all in all, God is sovereign. And His work is always going to prevail, and the work of the gospel, the preaching of the gospel, is going to continue regardless of how things work out. And so this morning I entitled the message, "Disciples Are Made, Not Born." And we're going to look at a passage in Acts chapter 16 and read verses 1 through 5. Acts 16. We're going to look at verses 1 through 5. Now, this is speaking of Paul and Silas as they've parted ways with Barnabas and John Mark. And it says, "Then he came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were there at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted to have him go on with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. And as they went through the cities, they delivered to them the decrees to keep, which were determined by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in faith and increased in number daily." And so the first slide I want to show you is a slide of this second missionary journey that Paul took. Now, prior to this, Paul and those with him took their first missionary journey. And, can you imagine covering 2,800 miles per se on that first missionary journey, and by both land and sea, not having an Uber driver to call up and say, "Hey, take me from point A to point B," but having to walk through that terrain and buy tickets to find a voyage sailing? Well, here is a picture of a blueprint of that first missionary journey as they begin, taking off. They started off in Antioch of Syria. And if you look off to the coast there, you can see the island of Cyprus. Well, that's where Barnabas and John Mark sailed to after they parted ways. And then if you follow the black line, it takes us into Tarsus and then moves us forward. And we end up in this place referred to as Derbe and Lystra. And here we're introduced in verses 1 and 2 to a disciple named Timothy, who's described as being well spoken of by the brethren. So Timothy, a disciple. What's a disciple? A disciple is a student. It's basically what the word means, student. And he's one who receives instruction from another. He's mentored. He's trained up. And that's what best describes Timothy at this time. Those who were consistent attendants to the ministry of Jesus, those who embraced his doctrine, his teachings, applied those things to their lives, they were called disciples. And we see this taking place. Timothy, verse 2, being well spoken of by the brethren, that tells us that he was a man of exceptional character, but he was a young man of exceptional character. His life and his testimony as a young man spoke volumes, because as it's described there, he was well known in that region. Can you imagine? Just the example this young man must have been, to be not only just sought out after the Apostle Paul, him being able to visually see him in the demonstration of his character and life, but just the people within that region were aware of who he was. And so as time went on, Paul and Timothy, they did a lot of ministry together. And Paul, from a Roman prison, would write his epistle to the Philippians. And look what he had to say in chapter 2 concerning Timothy. As he was getting ready to send Timothy to go visit the church at Philippi, he said, "But I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you shortly, that I also may be encouraged when I know your state. For I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state. For all seek their own, not the things which are of Christ Jesus. But you know his proven character, that as a son with his father, he served with me in the gospel." And just, can you imagine having a letter of recommendation from the Apostle Paul? Boy, not too many people got those, right? And here's young Timothy as one who received such a recommendation. And so as they're making their journey, setting out to reach the city of Philippi, Paul would later write, because when Paul arrives in Philippi, this is the introduction of Paul and Timothy beginning ministry together, and shortly hereafter we'll see them arrive in Philippi, and the church at Philippi, they had observed Timothy's proven character. So when Paul was in prison, later writing the epistle to the Philippians, they would know Timothy because he lived among them. He served among them. It's likely that on Paul's first missionary journey with Barnabas, when they journeyed to Derbe and Lystra, it's most likely that his grandmother, his mother, and he heard the gospel message and turned their hearts over to God. And it's just a beautiful picture of 3 generations: grandmother, her daughter, and her daughter's son. Just the gospel just being handed down from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. Timothy's mother is described as a believing Jew in verse 1. His father described as a Greek. Most likely his father wasn't a believer, but his mother and grandmother were. Paul attributed Timothy's spiritual growth to his grandmother and his mother. He wrote in his first epistle to Timothy, he said, "When I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded is in you also." Discipleship. You know where it begins first? Our homes. What an impact the grandmother and mother had upon Timothy. That's where discipleship begins. It has to be modeled in the home. Disciples don't come out of the womb born disciples. They are trained up. They are mentored as children in the home. The influences, that come in through the gateway to the home, these are the influences that are going to have the greatest impact and influence upon that next generation. That's where discipleship begins. It begins in the home. I just want to encourage young moms, single moms, and I'm sure there might be single dads too, but especially single moms, because what a privileged and awesome responsibility it is given to women to train up their children in the home. Most households where the husband is, at work, the mom is home with the children, during the day. And yet my heart goes out to those single moms, those single parents, single dads who are having to work plus train up their children. And just to share the heart that we have here at the church is we have some wonderful people that love your children, that are serving in children's ministry, that are looking forward to every single Sunday the opportunity to invest and stand with you in the discipleship of your children, to training them up, to teaching them God's ways, how important that is for us. And I want to point out an observation. Last week, we saw Barnabas take John Mark and sail to the island of Cyprus. Then Paul and Silas begin their journey, and shortly thereafter, the beginning of the journey, Paul sets his eyes on Timothy. And what that tells us is that it was of the utmost importance for the early church disciples to mentor the next generation. The fact that Barnabas would hold to his guns and say, you know what, I'm not letting John Mark go. I'm willing to continue to pour into his life. Yeah, he made a mistake, but you know what? I'm not going to lose hope on him. I'm going to continue to pour into his life. And then shortly thereafter, here's Paul, and he finds Timothy. And he says, you know what? I got to have this kid. I want this kid to serve alongside me in ministry. And it's important, it's of the utmost importance for us to follow their example in pouring into that next generation. I mean, think about it. Even in the Old Testament, Moses had Joshua. Joshua was young when he was always described as Moses' servant. And he was just somebody that Moses poured into. In fact, when Moses would take Joshua with him to the tabernacle, when the Shekinah glory of God's presence would fall upon the tabernacle and Moses would be ministering to the Lord, Moses would leave, Joshua would remain behind because he just loved God's presence. Think of Elijah had Elisha. Elisha had the school of the prophets. And so we just see this modeled throughout. In fact, Titus talks about, when Paul wrote his letter to Titus, he encouraged the older women to train up the younger women by example. Discipleship, it was so much. I mean, Jesus said, what? Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, teaching them. And so every generation, when we sit and we gather together, every generation present here this morning needs to be serving the Lord in some capacity together, mentoring one another, actively serving in order to provide a healthy environment for spiritual growth of all. It's so important for the spiritual growth of all that we're mentoring. And so we have young people serving alongside adults when we do our children's ministry at second service, mentoring them, having the next generation get used to teaching children and have an example set, to teach them. We do it with youth ministry. We have adults working with young people, pouring into the youth. Just look at the VBS that we're getting ready to do. We have a group of volunteers. So many of you have volunteered, and we're so thankful because it just, when many hands make light work, right? And it makes the opportunity to serve very enjoyable. But the beautiful thing is that's a perfect example of all the generations working together in order to pour into the next generation of children that are growing up in our community. It's a beautiful picture of discipleship, working with the VBS. Teaching from the pulpit. If you were here Christmas Eve, I shared the pulpit with 2 college students. If you were here just a few weeks ago, you got to hear D'Angelo share about how God has worked in his life and shared his testimony. And as he got ready to, he's in Bosnia right now, serving as a missionary. It's like I love surrounding myself with younger people. I love to pour into them. I want to give them opportunity to be used. And so I'm continually always looking for that next generation. God, who's next to pour into? Who's next to disciple? Who's next to, to train up, to be mentored? Whether we're doing evangelism outreach, whether we're doing a mission trip, I'm always looking for both young adults as well as adults to go on those trips, because we want so much to pour into that next generation. We want to raise them up. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is pouring into the younger generation, and then the younger generation occupying all the areas of ministry, and then the older people have no place to serve anymore. No, that's not our vision. That's not our desire. If you're still breathing, you're still able to serve God, right? If you still have a heartbeat, if you still have a pulse, the whole idea is, I'm trying to exhort us and encourage us, that whatever area of ministry you're serving here today in, that you would look for a younger person to join you, even if it's greeting at the door, so that people who come, they would see every age group represented, and just see that mentoring that is just taking place. Because, like I said, disciples, they're not born, they're made. They're an investment of pouring your life into the life of the next person, the next generation. And so Paul, having observed Timothy's character, he saw his potential. He knew that he would be a valuable asset to the work of the ministry in that region, because he was both familiar with Greek as well as Jewish culture, because he had a Jewish mother and a Greek father. So he would have been very, very effective, a great asset. And so Paul has Timothy circumcised, because in every community that Paul preaches the gospel in, his rule of thumb, go to the Jew first and then the Gentile. And so in verse 3, Paul is basically requesting of Timothy to side with his Jewish roots. Because in order for him to be accepted by the Jews, Timothy had to be circumcised. There was no other way. The Jews would not have accepted him. They would have rejected him. If Timothy claimed to be a Jew and wasn't circumcised, he would have been rejected because of his disobedience to the Abrahamic covenant. And he would have been exiled, and Paul with him as a result. And so the door of opportunity to minister would have been taken away. And so, circumcision by no means was a means of salvation. We talked about that lightly in our study last week, because on the flip side of that, Paul actually tells Titus not to be circumcised. Now, Titus was 100% Gentile, but because of the Judaizers and their false doctrine in the church that was going around telling people that you have to be circumcised in order to be saved, Paul specifically told Titus not to be circumcised, because salvation is not dependent upon that. And so one of the reasons that Paul was imprisoned in Rome, the place where he wrote the letter to the Philippians, was because he was accused of bringing Gentiles, uncircumcised Gentiles, into the tabernacle. It's recorded in Acts 21. It says, when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing Paul in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help this man. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." And that's when they seized Paul and they dragged him away, and he ends up in prison and eventually making his way to Rome as a result of this. And so, with everyone in that region aware that Timothy had a Greek father and a Jewish mother, verse 3, Timothy had to be circumcised in order to effectively go into the synagogues and to go into the temple and do ministry along with Paul. Paul had this heart of being all things to all men. He expresses it in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. In verse 19, he says this, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law. Not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. So Paul had this heart to just find this common ground. Whenever he was going out and doing ministry, he would always look to find some common ground to be able to effectively minister to people. And because the spiritual edification of a believer is far more valuable than the exercising of some freedom that we might have. Paul was one who was always looking for the spiritual edification. And so Paul uses it as a sacrificial means of serving, not a gratification. So Paul wasn't like, I'll be all things to all people and I'll gratify my flesh as a result. No, Paul's using it as I'll be all things to all people, but in order to do that, it's going to require a sacrifice on my part. I'm going to have to set aside a liberty that I have in Christ in order to be more effective. And so Paul always chose to deny himself any liberty that he may have been entitled to in order to win the more. And we should be like-minded in that. For example, Paul purposely chose not to receive any financial support from the Corinthian church. Even though he was entitled to do so, he just relinquished that. He didn't want to receive any financial support because those there who opposed Paul would have used it against him, and he wanted to basically take the ammunition out of their gun, And so he did that, for one. When ministering to the Jews, Paul would observe certain Jewish ceremonies that he knew he didn't have to under the new covenant with Jesus Christ. Paul knew he didn't have to celebrate Passover. He knew he didn't have to celebrate Feast of Tabernacles, but he did so because he wanted to reach the Jews with the gospel. But he knew he didn't have to. And then for the Gentiles, when ministering to the Gentiles, Paul was not obligated or pushed the Gentiles to be obligated or to impress upon them any Jewish ceremonies. So when he was ministering to the Gentiles, he wasn't forcing them or telling them, hey, you got to partake of Passover and you got to do the Feast of Tabernacles, and begin to lay on them all these feasts. And then when ministering to the weak believer, who doubted, they were weak in their faith and they doubted as to whether or not, they were supposed to celebrate a certain feast. Paul wouldn't put the burden, hey, whatever you're comfortable doing, you want to celebrate Passover? Hey, let's do it. All for the purpose of reaching them for the gospel. And how much more for us to be able to set aside our freedoms, our liberties, for the spiritual edification of others, for the spiritual growth of others. See them grow and be effective in their ministry. And so Paul was other-centered. And the last thing that Paul wanted ever to do was to cause harm to somebody's spiritual growth or their edification. So he refrained from those things. And observe the fruit of applying these truths to our ministry. Look at verse 5. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. Strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily as a result of just applying these truths. Discipleship, looking to mentor and raise up the next generation, being all things to all men. As they took the apostles' decrees that they received there when they were in Jerusalem and received the messages that the apostles had handed down, that no, you don't have to be circumcised in order to be saved. And they began teaching these messages and being willing to make not exercise any religious freedom per se, all for the benefit and well-being of others. I mean, that was the heart of Paul. That was the ministry of Paul, and we see the fruit of it there. Because there are other methods to grow a church. Entertainment, motivational speaking, showing forth lots of charisma, talent. Our flesh can easily be manipulated if we're not careful, because there's a lot of stuff going on out there today. But numerical growth without spiritual growth is not healthy. They both need to take place together. And when we look at the inception of the early church, how their numerical growth was based on not entertainment, not motivational speaking. Their numerical growth was they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, the breaking of bread, and prayer. That's basically what's taking place here in Acts when we're reading about how the church grew. And there again in verse 5, they were strengthened in the faith and increased in number daily. As a result of what? As a result of Paul and Silas arriving with the letters from the apostles in Jerusalem, with the message of God's word, letting people know that, hey, you don't have to be circumcised in order to be saved. You just need to abstain from sexual immorality and things that are polluted, that kind of thing. And the church began to grow. Paul exhorted Timothy. He said, preach the word in season and out of season. In other words, when it's convenient, when it's not convenient. We think of the seasons of life. We experience winter, spring, summer, fall. Whatever season of life, whether it's windy or rainy, partly cloudy, sunny, no matter what the conditions, spiritually speaking, whatever the spiritual weather conditions are, we are to preach the word. We're to demonstrate the word. When Paul spoke to Titus, exhorting the older women to mentor the younger women, he was exhorting them by their example. Not by their words, but by their example. Teach these women how to love their husbands. Teach these women, how to, not be given over to worldly temptations and worldly lusts. It's like Paul, when he was closing out his ministry in life, he said, I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. And how do we do that? Just line upon line, precept upon precept. It's just being willing to do that. And so I just want to encourage us as a church body this morning, that whatever area of ministry God puts on your heart to serve in, look for that next generation to bring alongside you, to pour into them and to mentor them. We'll be doing that at VBS. Every generation just gathered together to do what? To pour into the children of our community.